All right, let's just dive right in. Ancient prophecies can feel like these impossible riddles. But what if the whole point isn't just to find one single correct answer? In this explainer, we're going to dig into the literary genius and, honestly, the persuasive power behind one of the Old Testament's most fascinating prophets, Isaiah. So our story starts right here, with this promise written, get this, over 2,700 years ago. Isaiah talks about a second time that God is going to gather his people. Now, the first time, well, that's easy. Everyone thinks of the Exodus from Egypt. So the question becomes, what could this second, even bigger gathering possibly be? And that question, well, it leads us straight to the heart of the debate. Is Isaiah talking about a literal geopolitical event, like the future restoration of the nation of Israel? Or is he painting a much bigger, more symbolic picture, something like the global spread of a faith? That's the puzzle we're going to try and unpack together. Now, what's really cool is that the text itself is just bursting with these vivid details. It describes this huge regathering from every corner of the planet. But the specifics? Oh man, they have been passionately debated by scholars for literally thousands of years. It's a classic interpretive challenge. I mean, the promises here are just epic. It's not just a simple come on home. We're talking about a grand reunion of the divided northern and southern kingdoms. It paints this picture of old enemies finally being dealt with, and even a miraculous highway being built for the people to return. You can almost see it, can't you? Okay, so how are we supposed to make sense of all of this? Well, scholars pretty much fall into two main camps. And to make it really clear, we'll look at the work of two heavy hitters, John Oswalt, who takes a more literal view, and E.J. Young, who sees it all as figurative. And this is where you can really see the split. For Oswalt, it's all about the historical nation of Israel. The gathering is a physical, boots-on-the-ground event. The enemies are real enemies. He even suggests that the founding of modern Israel in 1948 could be part of this. But for Young, nope, this is all symbolism. The gathering isn't about land in the Middle East, it's about the church growing in the greater field of the world. And conquering enemies isn't war, it's missionary work. But hold on, there's a bit of a wrench in the gears for that purely literal view. See, other prophecies, like one in Deuteronomy 30, kind of lay out a specific order of events. First, the people have a change of heart and return to God, and then God returns them to the land. And a spiritual return on a national scale like that, well, that hasn't really happened yet. So we're kind of at a deadlock. And this forces us to ask a totally different question. What if we're so hyper-focused on decoding what the prophecy means for the future that we're completely missing something just as important? How the prophet masterfully delivered his message. Maybe the artistry is part of the meaning. And to see this artistry in action, wow. We're going to jump over to another chapter, Isaiah 28. This is where we see that Isaiah isn't just a seer. He's a master rhetorician, an incredible public speaker who is setting the most brilliant trap you've ever heard of for his audience. Okay, so here's how the strategy works. It's a perfect three-step play. First, he starts by slamming their rivals, the northern kingdom. This gets the leaders of Judah in the south all nodding along, thinking, yeah, you tell them, they love it. And then, just when he's got them eating out of the palm of his hand, bam, he springs the trap. He kicks it off with, woe to the drunkards of Ephraim. Now, just imagine you're a noble in Judah. You're at a party, maybe you've had a little wine yourself, and you hear this. You're thinking, haha, yes, give it to him, Isaiah. Those guys up north are the worst. He has you exactly where he wants you. Then comes the pivot. The original Hebrew is just so sharp and direct. Wagam ele. And also these. He literally turns and points to the very nobles in front of him and declares, but these also stagger from wine. You're just as bad. Suddenly, that whole condemnation he was aiming north, it swings around and hits them right between the eyes. Oh man, can you imagine the fury in that room? Who does this guy think he is? Their response is just dripping with sarcasm. But what's absolutely incredible is how God, through Isaiah, takes their own mockery and flips it right back on them with this profound, chilling irony. So the nobles scoff at him. They're like, who is he to teach us? Are we little babies who just stopped breastfeeding? They mock his simple, repetitive lessons, his line upon line, precept upon precept. In their arrogance, they think he's treating them like children. So, to make fun of him, they start imitating his preaching, but with childish sounds. In Hebrew, it would have sounded something like this. Kisav l'kesav, kav l'kesav, kav l'kav, kav l'kav. It's meant to be gibberish. It's pure baby talk.
Yep, this is pretty much the ancient equivalent of going blah, blah, blah. They're taking this clear, urgent message and just turning it into meaningless noise because, frankly, they just don't want to hear it.
And this is the brilliant, terrifying twist. Isaiah's response is basically, oh, okay. You think my clear words are just babble? Fine. God will speak to you, but it'll be through actual babble, the foreign lips and strange tongues of the invading Assyrian army. Since they refused to listen to God's message in their own language, they'd be forced to hear his judgment in a language they literally could not understand. The irony is just stunning. So what does all this, the puzzle from Isaiah 11 and this rhetorical trap from Isaiah 28, what does it teach us about how we should be reading these ancient texts today? Well, here are a few key takeaways. First, prophecy isn't a crystal ball. It's not just history written in advance, it's complex, mysterious literature. Second, it's totally normal for smart, respected scholars to disagree. Third, how the message is delivered, the literary skill, the strategy, that's a huge part of understanding the what. And finally, and this is a big one, we should be incredibly careful before we try to map ancient prophecies onto modern-day news headlines.
And so that leaves us with one last thought. In our hunt for certainty, for the right answer, do we sometimes miss the richness, the art, and the deep intellectual challenge these texts are offering us? Maybe the real value isn't in finding a single key to unlock the future, but in appreciating the incredible depths of meaning they hold for us, right here, right now.